Drugs in sport. The man who revealed the shocking extent of the Russian doping scandal says he believes 20% or more of all athletes could be cheating. I'm Dana Lewis, and this is an Insight exclusive. Welcome to an Insight exclusive. Performance-boosting drug cocktails. Russian secret agents posing as plumbers to cover it up. Sports fans deceived for years. A secret state-run conspiracy. Well, it could be a Hollywood script, but it's real, according to the report alleging Russian involvement in a vast doping scam. And now the man behind those revelations has told this program that from what he's learned, he believes 20% of all athletes around the world could be cheating, at least 1 in 5 athletes. The report on behalf of the World Anti-Doping Agency was released in December. It says more than 1,000 Russians benefited from a doping program that saw competitors cheat in 2 Olympic competitions. Russia has denied Kremlin involvement and says it's cracking down on drug cheats. But this week, the heads of 19 national anti-doping organizations called for Russia to be banned from both competing and hosting international sporting events. The man who wrote that report on behalf of the World Anti-Doping Agency, Canadian law professor Richard McLaren, is with me now here in the studio. Richard, welcome.
Thank you.
Did you want this job? I mean, how did a mild-mannered law professor from London, Ontario, find himself at the epicenter of what may be the largest doping scandal in sports history?
Well, I didn't ask for the job, and I didn't expect to get it either, but I have a long history of doing these kinds of investigative work, stretching back to some problems that occurred at the Summer Games in Sydney back in September 2000, involving Marion Jones and C.J. Hunter, and a series of investigations, including Major League Baseball in the middle of 2007, 2006. And so I was chosen because I, first of all, had the work with the previous commission that was run by Richard Pound, the 3 of us, the independent commission, and that's why I got called when I was doing it myself, the independent person, because it was just me. So I was a natural follow-up, but I wasn't looking for the work, but when they asked me to do it, I thought it would be an interesting project, and it certainly grew out of what I'd previously done.
More than interesting. Did the Kremlin ever try to interfere with your investigation?
Not that I'm aware of, no. I don't think they did at all.
Over 1,000 athletes involved across some 30 sports. It's mind-boggling how deep this goes, how big a doping scandal it is.
The scale is quite extraordinary, and when I first got involved in this, it looked to me like the story in the New York Times that generated my appointment was all about Sochi. It was all about swapping samples at Sochi. And very soon after I started to work on that, which I thought was pretty fanciful and couldn't actually have occurred, I rapidly began to realize, oh yes, it had, and there was much more to that than just Sochi. And so all of a sudden, within days, my work, which was directed at Sochi, suddenly became much broader, and then this full scale and scope of what's gone on comes out in the report in December across a number of sports and hundreds of athletes.
And not just one Olympics, but you also said that London was dramatically affected, the results in the London Olympics. Did the Russians use London as a warm-up trial for victory in Sochi?
I suppose you could put it that way, but I think it was really, they were using London to try and achieve the best outcomes they possibly could in terms of medals. That ended up being a warm-up for what went on in Sochi, but it wasn't necessarily planned that way. They wanted to do well in London, and they wanted to do well later the following year in the IAAF championships in track and field or athletics.
Let's go through the evidence a little bit.
Sure.
Should I call them allegations or evidence? Because the Russians would say they're allegations.
Well, I put everything that I could put, which is not everything that I have, on a website so that anybody could look at it. You can make your own determinations as to whether it's evidence or allegations. From my point of view, it's definitely evidence, and without a doubt establishes all the different points that I've made in the report.
Can you just review that for people who haven't followed it minute by minute? Because it's very, very complicated. But in essence, this very sophisticated program by the Russians to allow their athletes to do better, to cheat in the Olympics, comes down into Sochi, a hole in the wall where they're switching urine samples.
I know, it sounds fanciful, doesn't it?
It does.
Let's go back a little bit before Sochi.
It did.
Because what we first discovered very quickly in the investigation was something that we called the disappearing positive methodology. And quite simply, that was the Moscow lab, which is an accredited lab at the time of the World Anti-Doping Agency. And when they run their initial testing procedure on a sample, it can indicate whether or not there's a prohibited substance. Mm-hmm. If it was, and they were only testing samples coming from Russian athletes, primarily, there was a few foreigners involved, then if the screen showed that it was likely positive, that would get reported up a chain of people to the Ministry of Sport, the deputy minister, a man named Nagarnov, and instructions would come back down to do one of two things: continue the analysis in the ordinary course that the lab would always do with terms of bench work, or save that result. And that meant that they would doctor and the data responses by the lab, but also the one that is run by the World Anti-Doping Agency. It's called ATOMS. It's just a computerized central system. And so false data would be entered about the fact that this was not a positive result. And then no lab analysis would ever be done. So that was going on from 2011 right through 2015. So that's going on in the background, has not connected to Sochi. And then there were other techniques that were being used to try and ensure that athletes, when they went to games like the London 2012 games,
they were actually giving them cocktails for doping. They were actually doctoring the bottles, which are supposed to be tamper-proof. And this was done by the Federal Security Service.
Correct, but the cocktail part emerged long before the bottle part. So the cocktail part is developed, and that's part of the doping program that different athletes are on. And then they began to realize after London 2012 that the only way they could successfully continue any kind of doping program was to be able to open those bottles and replace the urine. And so that work started after 2012, and the first time that we can establish that it was actually occurring was following the IAAF World Championships in 2013. And that was the first real trial runs of opening the bottles and changing the contents of the bottles. And then that was developed into the sophisticated program that involved, yes, the sample would be passed through a hole in the wall so that the person on the other side could then draw urine from a clean sample bank that was stored elsewhere than in the lab.
By the FSB, Russia's spy service.
Yes, the internal security system.
They were posing as?
Well, the one that we can identify was posing as a plumber, so he had accreditations to be in the building. Any lab needs that kind of service, 24 hours in that sort of operation. So he had full access, but it was all a cover-up. He was an agent of the FSB.
State-sponsored. You used that term in your first report, but the Russians say the fact you didn't use that term in your second report, and I quote a Russ Atta statement, that you excluded potential involvement of top country officials. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, and that results primarily from a discussion I had with Vitaly Smirnov in between the first report and the second. He's the man who was appointed by Putin to run the public anti-doping commission.
To clean it up.
Yes, and to present a whole new system for Russia. And we had lengthy discussion, and in that he made the point that from a Russian's point of view, a state-sponsored system would have to involve Putin and the inner circle. And on that basis, if you take that definition, I don't have any evidence that that's the case. My evidence stops with the Deputy Minister of Sport, Nagarnov. And so I did change the terminology in the second report in recognition of the fact that the Russians take a different view of what state-sponsored is than what I might do. But
you're a lawyer.
The facts are the facts.
Let's just talk about it. If you're a lawyer, if you were to take this case into court, which it never goes to court because it's not a criminal matter.
Right.
If you were to take it into court, do you think a judge would say this was state-sponsored?
I think you certainly could put that label on it. And so what I've done really is I've put the facts out there and let people put what label on it that they want to put on it. I did change the way I described it in the second report quite deliberately as a result of my discussions with the Russians.
The sports minister has now been elevated to deputy prime minister. His name is Vitaly Mutko. Was he involved?
You can't run a ministry of the size of the Ministry of Sport and have a deputy minister engaged in the disappearing methodology I was speaking of a few minutes ago without having knowledge. At least at the minimum, you've got to have administrative knowledge. You're in charge of the entire ministry. I have some evidence that connects him to some aspects related to football, but I don't have any other evidence beyond that. So his direct involvement that what went on in Sochi is not clearly established in my work.
Evidence linked to football in terms of doping of athletes?
Yes.
You have some evidence that you have given to who?
That's been put, all the evidence that we have in relation to particular individual athletes has been given to the World Anti-Doping Agency, and they in turn have provided it to the relevant international sports federations who are now dealing with the information.
Is that why now we hear public questions about whether the Russians should ever have the World Cup in 2018?
I think there are a lot of different reasons for that, but that would certainly be one of them.
He has come out, since your report says this is geopolitics, some sort of international conspiracy against world sport. Your report was unfair, essentially, and there was no conspiracy.
Well, that's his view. I would certainly take a different view. I think when you operate a system that is as sophisticated as the one that operated in Sochi and the one that operated in the Moscow lab with the disappearing positive methodology, you have to admit that that's a centralized system.
Quick question about hacking. There's a lot of talk about hacking right now in the United States because of the election and the DNC headquarters that was hacked. WADA had its own computers hacked by somebody called the Russian Bear, which is the same name that was linked to the DNC hacking. Do you believe that the WADA hacking was Russian government directed?
I didn't have really any involvement in the WADA hacking, and because I was the independent person, I stayed away from what's going on at WADA, so I really don't have much to comment on in terms of the hacking of the WADA computers. I do know, though, that there were attempts to invade my own systems. I don't know who they were, and they were blocked, so that didn't happen in my case. And some of my other people that worked for me had similar experiences.
And you don't know the source of that, but you know that somebody was trying to hack into your system?
Yes.
Richard, again, thanks for being with us. Dr. Richard McLaren, we'll continue our interview with him right after this.